We have spoken about Sufism on this channel quite a lot, that concept that is often described as Islamic mysticism. And in those discussions, we've also talked about the fact that Sufism, at least for the most part, consists of a huge number of different orders, known in Arabic as turuq in plural or a tariqa in singular. These orders all have unique characteristics, techniques, and chains of transmission. But in this world of so many orders, there are a few that are much larger or more popular than others. We've covered a few of the bigger ones already, like the Shazili, the Naqshbandi, and the Ni'matullahi orders. But if there's any Sufi order that I would argue, and I think many people would agree, is probably the largest and most widespread of them all, it is probably the Qadiri order, also known as the Qadiriyya in Arabic. This order exists essentially all over the world and is also one of the oldest of all the tariqas in Sufism. So today, I thought we'd dive deeper into this particular tradition of Sufism, as well as its foundational and most central figure, who is Abul-Qadir al-Jilani. The Qadiriyya is not only probably the largest Sufi order in the world, but also one of the oldest. Its name and origins are traditionally traced back to the 12th century and to a very important and influential figure, Abul Qadir al-Jilani. Abul Qadir is possibly one of, if not the most, famous Sufi figure or saint in the Islamic world. While internationally the major names are of course people like Rumi or Ibn Arabi, in the wider Islamic world itself as a whole, the situation is a bit different. Rumi is obviously a household name in Persian-speaking countries and in Turkey, for example. But in the Islamic world itself as a whole, there are other names that are probably more famous, in particular people like Abu Hamid al-Ghazali and Abul Qadir al-Jilani. He is remembered not just as the founder of a Sufi order, but as one of the greatest scholars and saints, or walis as it's called in Arabic, in the history of the Islamic world. So naturally, this discussion about the Qadiri order will begin by looking at this person. Abdul Qadir was born in the year 1077 in a region called Jailan, which is in modern Iran. By most accounts, though, he seems to have been from an Arab family, both of his parents being descendants of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the fourth Rashidun Caliph and first Shi'i Imam. It's quite likely that his family had at least lived in Jailan for a few generations at that point, though, as Abdul Qadir himself would say later in life that his Arabic was not necessarily on the level of a native speaker, so he would have grown up primarily speaking Persian as his mother tongue. There is some disagreement in scholarship on whether he comes from an Arab family, as he himself claims, and his successors or his descendants claim, or if he's actually from a Persian family. But I think the majority opinion is that he comes from an Arab family originally, but grew up in a Persian Iranian environment. Now, Jailan, as beautiful and peaceful as it may have been, didn't offer much in terms of higher education, though. So, at the age of 18, Abdul Qadir decided to travel to Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate and center for much intellectual activity at the time, arriving there in 1095. According to the biographies, his first years in the city were quite difficult. As a student without any proper income, he occasionally was at the point of starvation, but he managed to pull through and eventually the situation got better. Baghdad at this time was of course a very fascinating place full of activity of different sorts. Centuries before, it had seen its golden age in the 9th century during the heyday of the Abbasid civilization. And since then it had gone through various periods of change, decay, and restoration. The Abbasid caliphs were still at this point the symbolic leaders for much of the Muslim world, but the actual political power lay elsewhere. Until only shortly before Abdul-Qadir arrived, the area had been ruled by the Buyids, a Shi'i dynasty that had made significant changes, and now the Seljuks had taken over. The century preceding Abdul-Qadir's arrival here is often referred to as the Shi'i century, since a major part of the Islamic world was ruled by Shi'is at this time, the Buyids in Iraq and Iran, and the Fatimids in Egypt and North Africa. The period that followed, which is the one that Abdul-Qadir was living in, was this one that was very important for the development of Sunni Islam as we know it today. It was a direct response to the prominence of Shi'ism, both to distance themselves from the earlier Buyids, but also to be in direct opposition to the Fatimids. This quote-unquote Sunni revival, which in some ways should really be seen as the birth of Sunnism as we know it, meant that a Sunni identity was formulated clearly for the first time, and which included otherwise disparate groups in terms of jurisprudence and theology, which had previously been in bitter conflict from time to time. And it's also in this context that the great madrasas or schools were founded all across the Islamic world, such as the famous Nizamiyya founded by Nizam al-Mulk in Baghdad, precisely to strengthen Sunnism and Sunni scholarship. It was here that Abu Hamid al-Ghazali had taught for many years, and indeed, just as Abdul-Qadir entered Baghdad, would have been basically the time that Ghazali had his major crisis and went out into the desert. So they kind of cross paths in terms of time and place, although it's unsure if they ever actually met in person. And Jilani would have similar feelings about the city. He often says that he kind of felt that the city was morally corrupt and totally decadent, and very shortly after arriving, he just wanted to leave and go back home because he felt like it was detrimental to his faith to stay in the city. But eventually he decided to stay and to at least finish his studies, which he did. And hopefully to stay in order to maybe make a change for the better in the city, which arguably some would say he did also. He studied many fields in Baghdad, including Quran tafsir, like commentaries on the Quran. He studied grammar and hadith, but he was perhaps especially passionate about fiqh, jurisprudence, or Islamic jurisprudence and law. There were many established schools or madhabs of law at this time, but the largest and most popular in and around Baghdad was the so-called Hanbali school, named after Ahmad ibn Hanbal. This is still one of the four major schools of Sunni Islam today and is usually considered the most strict and conservative, the most literalist of them all. The Wahhabi tradition followed in Saudi Arabia today is largely influenced by the Hanbali school, for example. And perhaps unsurprisingly then, it was the Hanbali school that Abdul-Qadir primarily studied and thus identified with. He studied this school with a renowned scholar by the name of Abu Sa'id al-Mubarak al-Mukharrimi, one of the leading Hanbalis and Hadith scholars at that time, who also established a madrasa or school dedicated to teaching his madhab in the city where Abdul-Qadir studied. Al-Mukharrimi seems to have also become al-Jilani's spiritual teacher in the sense of being his Sufi Shaykh, or at least one of his Sufi Shaykhs. And that's where we get to another one of the central parts of Jilani's life and legacy, namely that he would become one of the most famous Sufis in history. It's told in the biographies that as a youth, when he was young in Baghdad, he would be overcome with these spiritual states that would be very heavy on him. They were very intense. He would often go out throughout his life, but especially in his younger days, he would go out into the desert for long periods and would stay there, and these spiritual states that came over him would completely overwhelm him, to the point that sometimes he would just scream uncontrollably. And this was so recurring in his life. This was a huge problem, it seems like, at least at that time, that among some of the people in the area, he was given a kind of nickname. He was known as Abdul-Qadir al-Majnoon, which means Abdul-Qadir the madman, because of his behavior and his what would turn out to be his spiritual states. And these were very difficult for him, and they left him sometimes incapacitated. So he really prayed to God for someone to come along to help him know what these states are, and maybe even to make them go away, or at least for him to be able to handle them. And it seems that that person did eventually arrive, and there are many stories about how this happened, and they're very interesting and fascinating. But who that person would become would be his Sufi sheikhs, right? His Sufi masters. And we already mentioned one of them, al-Mukharrami, who was also his his teacher of law. That's one of his teachers. But there's another Sufi teacher that seems to have been especially important to him, who is known as Hamad ad-Dabbas. Ad-Dabbas seems to have been a quite intense teacher, and there are stories of how he would test Abdul Qadir in quite extreme ways by being very mean to him, and at one point he even pushed him into the Tigris River in the middle of winter when the group were on their way to the Eid prayers in the mosque. All of this, of course, to strengthen his resolve and to weaken his nafs or his ego. Soon, Abdul Qadir, of course, became an accomplished mystic and Sufi himself, and would indeed go on to become perhaps the most renowned Sufi in Islamic history. Baghdad had, of course, been a significant city for Sufism. It was here that the first group who called themselves Sufis and who organized the movement and its teachings for the first time lived in the 9th and 10th centuries. That school, which was centuries old at this point already, still survived, and it was this lineage that Abdul Qadir came to be attached to. So when we look at his chain of spiritual transmission, we can see that it runs through some of the great early Sufi masters like Junaid, Sari Saqati, and Ma'ruf al-Karhi. Now, I said before that it isn't surprising that he was a Hanbali, given that he studied in Baghdad, which is the city that was dominated by that school at the time, but it might actually be a surprising detail to some who have maybe preconceived notions about the relationship between Sufism and quote-unquote orthodox Islam. It might seem strange that someone who so strongly represented the most strict and puritanical law school in Islam would also be a great Sufi master. But this isn't actually all that strange or unusual at all. As we've talked about in earlier videos, Sufism, or Tasawwuf as it's known in Arabic, wasn't its own branch of Islam or a separate tradition, but a certain science or practice within the religion, which Muslims of all walks of life and doctrinal backgrounds participated in. It was simply a part of Islam, and although we do indeed find many critics of Sufism within the Hanbali school too, we also have many examples of Hanbalis who were Sufis. Even the great and controversial intoxicated mystic al-Hallaj, famous for his radical exclamations about union with God, such as Ana al-Haq or I am the real, appears to have identified primarily with the Hanbali school of law too, as we explored in my previous dedicated episode on him. We also have people like Abdullah Ansari, one of the most influential early Sufis, who was also a Hanbali. So the idea that Abdul Qadir could both be a Hanbali and a Sufi is not a contradiction or really strange at all. But there has in fact been some debate in scholarship regarding his status as a Sufi. Of course, no one is denying that his historical legacy is that of being one of the greatest Sufi saints and authorities in history, but could this have been simply a later reconstruction by members of the order that was named after him? If we look at Abdul Qadir's own life, do we find any actual evidence that he was a Sufi? Some scholars, primarily Western ones, have argued that we don't. Abdul Qadir was primarily famous as a great preacher and scholar of law, Quran, and Hadith at the time, with little evidence for any mysticism. Some of them have also actually used the very argument that I mentioned before, that because al-Jilani was a representative of such a quote-unquote orthodox or strict school of Islam in the Hanbali school, he couldn't possibly also be a Sufi. Now, if you've watched my earlier videos on Sufism, or just based on my previous discussion here, you will know that this is a quite simplifying and really just inaccurate view of things. First of all, the very idea that there is this dichotomy between Sufism and Orthodox Islam on the other side is simply historically inaccurate. That's not the way it worked. Sufism was orthodoxy for most of history. It was mainstream Islam, or at the very least a central part of mainstream Islam. So that's number one, that dichotomy, that distinction makes no sense in this context. But secondly, we also show that it's very possible, even likely, that Abdul Qadir was both a Hanbali and a Sufi without there having to be any kind of contradiction about that at all. To my mind, it seems a bit of a stretch to deny him this characteristic, as it only really makes sense if we have certain preconceived notions about what a Sufi is supposed to be, especially if that definition is based on the false dichotomy between Sufism and perceived orthodoxy. In any case, during the second half of his life, Abdul Qadir became one of the most famous and renowned scholars in all of Baghdad. When his teacher al-Makharami passed away, Jilani was given the responsibility of taking over as head of the school. Thus, he became perhaps the primary authority on Hanbali law in the city. He would frequently give lectures and preach in the mosques, and his orations became more and more popular, being attended by hundreds of people, all being completely captivated by his charisma, personality, and vast knowledge. He gave tafsirs or commentaries on the Quran, he taught ethics, and he would also give legal opinions or fatwas to anyone who came with law questions. He was, as we saw, primarily an authority on Hanbali law, but he could also give rulings based on the Shafi'i school, which is another one of the most major schools of law, especially in this region at that time. He also had a ribat, or Sufi lodge, which was attached to the madrasa where he taught law. And in this Sufi lodge, in this ribat, he acted as spiritual guide to his murids, his spiritual disciples and students, himself guiding people on the mystical Sufi path to intimacy with God. And already at that time, many people saw him as one of the greatest of the awliya, the friends of God, often translated as the saints. There is even a saying attributed to Abdul Qadir, although this quote comes from a bit later on in the more miraculous hagiographical sources about him, but it is claimed that he himself said that these feet of mine are upon the necks of all the other awliya. Right, so seemingly putting himself in a very exalted position in terms of the spiritual hierarchy in Islam. All that preaching and teaching also translated into writings and works attributed to him. The most widely read of these works is probably the Futuh al-Ghaib, the Revelations of the Unseen, a collection of 78 discourses, possibly originally speeches that he held for his students that were then written down and then sort of ordered into different themes, either by Jilani himself or by one of his close students, possibly his son even. It's essentially discourses that deals with the spiritual path in different ways, so things like asceticism, self-examination, patience, and so on. Then there's a work called the Ghunya li Talibi Tariq al-Haq, a work that's probably written by the hand of Jilani himself, so a work that was actually written in with the purpose of being a book rather than as just a collection of orations, so to say. This is a much more comprehensive and structured work that goes through everything from the exterior aspects of Islam, such as how to pray, how to do the pilgrimage or give to charity, and then diving deeper into the Sufi path and its etiquette. There is also another work called the Fath Arabani, a collection of sermons by Abdul Qadir, recorded by his students and then put together by his son, Abdul Razak. And lastly, there is also another work often attributed to Abdul Qadir known as the Sir al-Asrar, or the Secret of Secrets, which also covers a broad spectrum of topics, but all essentially meant for a Sufi practitioner to aid them on their spiritual path. Now, the Sir al-Asrar is contested whether it should be attributed to Jilani. So some scholars think that it's probably by him, others think it might be a later composition and then attributed to him, but it certainly seems to be his style at the very least and his kind of teachings. And just a cursory reading of these works makes it very clear that the idea that Jilani was not a Sufi, it just, in my mind, is very hard to support. The scholar Hamza Malik, who has written a study on Jilani in English, concludes, quote, "We may already conclude at this point then that according to ideas that we find in Jilani's own works, and in light of what Western academics consider to be Sufi, Jilani's works must be deemed above and beyond anything else to be works of Sufism. Everything that we found in the works considered led to the Sufi goal. Whether it was instructions on prayer or attending a wedding feast, it all fitted into a system of Islam, Iman, and Ihsan that ultimately led beyond Fana to the state of Badaliyya." Now, all of this is, of course, a part, indeed a central part, maybe the central part, of a wider theological vision that Jilani had. Indeed, when we say that he was a Hanbali, or the synonymous word traditionalist, this is meant not only as a statement about his stances on jurisprudence, but also on theology. The Hanbali school of law, in most cases, also went hand in hand with a particular theology that goes under different names, sometimes simply also Hanbali, but also traditionalism and Atharism, both meaning essentially the same thing. What this is a general approach to Islam, both in terms of law and aqidah or theology, that is heavily textual. They will usually reject any form of speculative theology or philosophy, even the more orthodox schools of kalam theology like the Ash'aris and the Maturidis. Instead, they rely solely on the texts of the Quran and the Hadiths. If the Quran says that God has a hand, then that must mean that God has a hand, but with the added caveat that one holds to the principle of bila kayf, which means without how. In other words, we accept that God has a hand because this is how God describes himself in his revelation in the Quran, but we don't really speculate about how this works, because clearly God is different from human beings and so on, so it has to probably mean something else than a human hand, of course, right? But it's not our concern. We should just trust what the texts say without asking how this works on a sort of rational philosophical level. So that's the approach that was favored by the traditionalists or the Hanbalis in terms of theology. And when we read Abdul Qadir's works, he very much falls into this theological school, this position. He will write critically of many of the other schools of theology who use maybe more reason or more speculative arguments in their theology. He was very critical of that. And this also means that he falls into the traditionalist positions on most other subjects too, like the eternity of the Quran as God's speech, and all of the classic theological positions of the traditionalist school. He seems to sort of be very orthodox in that sense. But all of this really serves a purpose to help the individual come closer to God through the Sufi path. To think that we can arrive at knowledge about God through reason is a kind of hubris from the ego, and we should instead rest in complete submission and trust in the divine word and command, because it is the mystical and spiritual path that is at the core of his writings. And while he doesn't necessarily give any overarching method, instead leaving that to individual instruction from master to student, he does tell us some general principles of the Sufi path. The importance of having a Shaykh or a spiritual guide and teacher is paramount. This is very important, as he quotes this a common saying that the person who has no Shaykh has Shaitan as his Shaykh. So full submission to the Shaykh is central to walking the path. He approves of the classic forms of Sufi practice such as dhikr, or the invocation of God's names, including in group settings of chanting, as well as spiritual seclusion, known as khalwa, where the spiritual student will go into seclusion in a cell or in some other secluded place for up to 40 days. Usually 40 days is the number. There are a few principles or virtues, khisal, that he considers essential for the spiritual wayfarer. There is mujahada, or struggle. This is essentially the same word as jihad. So that is struggle against the ego and the lower self through piety and ascetic practices generally. There is tawakkul, or complete reliance upon God and trust in God. There is husn al-khulq, good character traits and good behavior. There is shukr, so being thankful or grateful for whatever may happen or come to you. So both pain and pleasure, all of it should be seen as coming from God, and thus one should be thankful for everything. There's sabr, patience, and sidq, truthfulness. As part of the first category, mujahada, which can really be said to encompass all of the other ones, he also mentions 10 habits that the seeker must make part of his own or her own person, and this is as outlined in the book by Hamza Malik. 1. To not swear or give oath by God. This habit is supposed to bring the practitioner better physical well-being and an increased determination. 2. To absolutely refrain from lying, even in jest or with good reason. This habit should benefit the practitioner with a purified mind. 3. To refrain from making promises that cannot be fulfilled, although to refrain from making promises completely is a better option. The practitioner of this habit is supposed to attain higher levels of modesty. 4. Not to curse or injure anything in creation, which should afford the practitioner compassion for other humans. 5. Not to invoke evil on anything in creation. 6. Not to accuse any other Muslim of polytheism, unbelief, or hypocrisy, regardless of whether one has evidence to support the accusation or not. 7. To keep clear of sinful behavior in both action and thought. 8. Not to place any burden or inconvenience on any other creature. This should allow one to gain strength for calling to good and forbidding wrong. 9. To remove the desire of wanting what other people have. This particular quality is understood to be the meaning of confidence in God, and it's also part of zuhd, or asceticism. It should allow the practitioner to attain a higher level of wara, or pious self-restraint. 10. The final quality is istiwadu, or humility. This is a quality that is seen as the perfection of God consciousness, or taqwa, and it seems that Jilani views this as perhaps the most important of all the 10 qualities, as one is tested with it at the beginning of the path and at its end. It prevents the mind from considering oneself to be better than any other human. So he seems to be very clear about this, that anyone who is, even who may seem to be below one in hierarchy, like this person is a non-Muslim, he says, well, then you should think that person better, because that person might eventually convert to Islam, and maybe you will fall into sin just before you die, and so maybe they will have a better afterlife than you. You don't know, right? So you should always think better of other people. You should think them better than yourself, regardless of who it is. Al-Qadir al-Jilani was one of the great Islamic scholars of his day, both one of the most popular preachers and experts on Hanbali Islamic law, but also seen as a spiritual giant who taught many students on the mystical path to God. He passed away in the year 1166 at the ripe old age of 90, having spent essentially his whole life in Baghdad, where his tomb complex is still a center of activity and veneration to this day. But the story obviously isn't over yet, because after his death, his legacy would continue in several ways, not least among them that he became the central figure and namesake for what would become the largest Sufi order in the world, the Qadiriyya. There is very little to no evidence that Abdul Qadir himself sort of established a tariqah, a Sufi order, in an organized way during his own lifetime. Instead, as is usually the case, it was up to his successors, his students down the line, to formally create a tariqah out of his, or based on his sort of spiritual authority and teachings. But how did this happen in this case? Abdul Qadir was busy in many ways, and he had many children. He had a lot of children. And these children would go on to become very important. They had very high status in the city of Baghdad. Indeed, the Jilani family, after him, would become perhaps the most prominent religious family, so to say, family of religious importance, in Baghdad for centuries afterwards. And many of his sons, and possibly daughters too, I suppose, were also successors in a spiritual sense. He had a son called Abdul Razak, who seems to have taken over the madrasa after he died, and also seems to have inherited the role of the Shaykh, or at least one of the Shaykhs, that carried forward the spiritual transmission from him. It was also Abdul Razak that gathered together a lot of the writings, or at least the orations, the preachings and speeches that had been written down, and sort of collected them into these different works by Jilani that we know today. So many of his sons, in particular perhaps Abdul Razak, were very important for spreading the word about his father. He also included a biography about his life that sort of established him as one of the great saints of his era. And at this point also in these biographies, we also start seeing a lot of the miracles that is attributed to Abdul Qadir. Abdul Qadir, this is, at least in the Islamic world, this is one of the things that he's most widely famous for, is that he performed a lot of what's known as karamat, so miracles of various sorts, like more than many other people. We don't find them as much in the first biography of his son. They come more later on, and we'll get to some of those writings very, very soon. But this was kind of unusual. Even Ibn Arabi, who did consider Abdul Qadir to be like the pole of his age, he still was a bit uncomfortable, it seems like, or it's like he thought it was strange that he would perform all these miracles, because usually when you have that kind of spiritual status, you're supposed to not like reveal them too much, right? It's like bad modesty to do that. So Ibn Arabi, he seems to say that Abdul Qadir was obviously the pole of the age, the qutub, the highest spiritual authority for his time and place, and that he must have had a kind of special mission or special status, which is why he would have acted in ways that to him was a bit unusual and strange. How Abdul Qadir came to have such a high standing in the world of Sufi saints is a question that has been answered in different ways. On the one hand, the fact that he was a primary representative of the famous Baghdadi school of Sufism, and also one of the last ones before the Mongol invasions and thus the complete destruction of that great city. That's probably important. But the hagiographies that were composed after his death also helped solidify his position not only as a great wali or saint, but as the very qutub or pole, the highest spiritual authority in the world. Aside from his son al-Razaq, the legend of Jilani's great saintly status was further strengthened in the writings of a man called Nuruddin Ali al-Shatanufi. He wrote a very famous hagiography that contains stories of the many karamat or miracles that Abdul Qadir supposedly performed, miracles that had become part and parcel of his general legacy. In some circles, he was seen not only as the qutub, but as the qutub al-aqtab, the pole of poles, right? So this tells you really how high status he had and still has in many parts of the Islamic world, especially in the world of Sufism. And it is primarily this saintly status and legacy that is at the core of the Qadiri Sufi order. Of course, he had students who carried on his spiritual transmission and teachings and who spread the chain to different parts of the world. For instance, the great Andalusian mystic Ibn Arabi, called al-Shaykh al-Akbar, or the greatest master, who we mentioned just before. He is known for his doctrine of the oneness of being, wahdat al-wujud, which has been very influential, but also very controversial. He was famously not part of any particular tariqah, because basically tariqah, Sufism, these orders hadn't really developed that much at this time, and he also comes from the Islamic West, where that really hadn't arrived yet. So he wasn't himself part of a tariqah, and neither did any particular tariqah, in an organized form at least, form from him after his death. But he does tell us that when he was in Mecca, he met one of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani's spiritual students, Yunus ibn Yahya al-Hashimi, and actually received a khirqa, or cloak of initiation, from him. So if there's any order that Ibn Arabi can be associated with, it would probably be the Qadiriyya, since he took spiritual transmission directly from one of Jilani's own students. The thing is, only a century or two later, the Qadiri order and lineage had spread to many different corners of the Islamic world. By the 15th century, it had a presence in the Middle East, of course, but also in North Africa, in Spain, Turkey, India, Ethiopia, and East Africa generally. Soon it would even spread to East Asia and places like China, where it has remained one of the most prominent Sufi orders there, and today this remains the case. The Qadiri order can essentially be found all over the world and is most likely, again, the most widespread Sufi order in history. The famous Mughal prince Dara Shikoh was a Qadiri. The Chinese Sufi Qi Jingyi developed the order in his home country. The 19th century Algerian freedom fighter and mystic Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, or Amir Abdul Qadir, was a Qadiri. The 20th century proponent of non-violent struggle against French colonialism, Ahmadu Bamba, was originally a Qadiri before he created his own Muridiyya order, and the list goes on. But the thing with the Qadiri order is that, much more so than most other orders, it is very difficult to pin down or to define. And this was true from the beginning. Unlike some of the other earliest organized Sufi orders, like the Rifa'iyya or the Suhrawardiyya, the Qadiri order never had any centralized leadership or fixed organized structure in terms of practices or teachings. Of course, Abdul Qadir had taught students on the path, but he didn't really lay down any specific instructions or spiritual rule or method that could be used in an organized or overarching way by his successors in the lineage. He gave general instructions, like the fact that he obviously approved of things like communal dhikr, but he didn't give particular instructions on how it was to be performed. It seems that his approach was to guide each student according to the specific needs that they had at any given moment, rather than any overarching method. What this has resulted in, both historically and today, is that while the Qadiri tariqah is very widespread in different parts of the world, it can also look vastly different from place to place, even in some of its fundamentals. The sheikhs in different locales, while all tracing their lineage and chain of transmission back to Abdul Qadir, thus had a lot of autonomy and independence in how to lead its local communities, so to say. Thus, unlike many other orders that can be characterized by different methods or styles, like the Naqshbandi focus on silent dhikr and solitude in the crowd, the Chishti emphasis on charity, music, and distance from political power, the Mevlevi whirling dervishes, and the poetry of Rumi, the Qadiri order is almost impossible to pin down in this way because it simply takes so many different forms in different places. Because of this openness, it's also been able to very easily adapt to local cultures and customs, thus often taking manifestations that can appear quite maybe tolerant or, again, quite open. One example of this is the aforementioned Chinese Qadiri Qi Jingyi, who lived in the 18th century and who integrated Neo-Confucian and even Taoist elements into the practice. What unifies all Qadiris in the world is thus not some particular method or practice, any specific set of prayers or meditation techniques. All of that can vary. Indeed, some would say that there isn't even one Qadiri order as such at all, properly speaking. Instead, the unifying factor is the figure of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani himself as the highest spiritual authority and pole, a determining point in the spiritual chain that connects all Qadiris back not only to him, but through him all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad himself. Even so, there are a few things that we might be able to say about what tends to be characteristics of the Qadiri order, even if it is generalizations. One thing, of course, is that just like other Sufi orders, basically all other Sufi orders, they practice zikr. And zikr is this chanting of God's names or the proclamation of faith, La ilaha illallah, there's no God but God, that is often done in a group setting together. And the Qadiri zikr, unlike, for example, the Naqshbandi dhikr, which is a silent dhikr, it's done internally, the Qadiri dhikr tends to be loud. It tends to be a loud dhikr in group and also quite intense. So they will sometimes involve standing up and sometimes intense movements of the body, and the chanting itself is often a more sort of harsh, intense kind of chanting of the words. And it's also often in the Qadiri order, it's quite common to see drums, frame drums that accompany dhikr. That's one thing. Speaking of music, the practice of sama, which is a common practice in Sufism where one will listen to a recited poetry or music, sometimes musical instruments too. Famously, Qawwad in India, for example, is a kind of like this is music to elevate the soul, essentially. This differs a lot from place to place. In his writings, al-Jilani seemed to have accepted sama as a very popular, prominent practice among the Sufis in Baghdad too at that time. But he gives certain sort of instructions on how to behave properly when one finds oneself in such a musical concert. And it puts some limits on who can go and in what circumstances and so on, but it seems to be something that he accepts. And so because there's an ambivalence in the order, there are different approaches within the order globally. So some Qadiri groups in some parts of the world are quite austere and don't like those kinds of more ecstatic expressions, for example, whereas in other places they can be quite intense and colorful. So as an example, perhaps, in West Africa in the 19th and 20th century, the Qadiri order was perhaps the order that was most prone to using drums and music and singing, as opposed to the Tijaniyya order, for example, where that is generally not used very much. Of course, the Muridiyya then appeared, which also uses music more, but that's one example. Whereas in India, during Mughal times, the Qadiri order were much less prone to music, whereas the Chishti order, which is another prominent order in India, maybe the most prominent, music all around. Like music is very important in that order. So in that context, the Qadiris are much more what's the word? They're much less prone to that, whereas in another context, they might be much more prone to that. So you see the difference in different contexts. Another example is in Sudan, where most Sufis are Qadiri, and where there's often very colorful singing and even dancing rituals and practices that one finds among the Sufis there. Very, very beautiful clothing and singing. And they're also Qadiri, right? So huge diversity again. Now, all of these spiritual practices have as their goal the subduing of the lower self, the nafs or the ego, to eliminate your base desires and come closer to God in an experiential and spiritual sense, even to experience the annihilation of the self and its limited individual will, known as fana, which Jilani also talks about in his writings. Another aspect that we already mentioned is the fact that the non-centralized character of the Qadri order generally has allowed it to adapt to different cultural and social contexts to a major degree. As such, there are of course many sub-branches that have appeared over the centuries in different geographical regions, and it would be very boring if I would just list all these different sub-branches. There are many of them. There are some Sufi orders that aren't even considered sub-branches of the Qadri order necessarily, but that basically are like developments from the Qadri order. For example, I think the Ni'matullahi order, which is famous in Iran primarily, could be seen by some as a kind of branch of the Qadri order that kind of grew into its own order because the founder was a Qadri. But also, I mentioned the Muridiyya, which is one of the biggest orders in West Africa, founded by Ahmad Bamba. And Ahmad Bamba was, as I mentioned, a Qadri. That was his tariqa affiliation before he created his own order, the Muridiyya. And so arguably that could also be seen as a kind of development from the Qadri order. So there are many sub-branches, and a lot of the other orders are connected to the Qadri order. It's a whole thing. And I'm not going to list them all, as I said, but you can look that up if you're interested in the many ways that it has developed over the centuries. Now, since Abdul Qadir was a very staunch Sunni Muslim and conservative Hanbali scholar, one might assume that the order itself must follow this character too, but that's not necessarily true. To be a Hanbali is in no way a requirement, and sheikhs and members of the order have belonged to all of the different schools of law. Of course, there is a general emphasis on the importance of following the Sharia as a requirement of the path, but what that means on a particular level can differ from school to school and on different, in different contexts. The general rule of diversity applies here as well, as there are movements within the Qadiri order that can certainly appear to be much more ecstatic or heterodox. Especially in relationship to the saintly status of Jilani himself, that status has led to unusual developments like the so-called Jilala in Morocco, a kind of tariqa with a big emphasis on music therapy similar to Gnawa music, and who, according to some sources, seem to venerate Jilani in a very intense way. Some sources even say that they essentially worship Jilani. Of course, it's rarely that simple, but it seems that some take that status of Jilani to a very, they take it very far, right? If we look at the Qadiris and the relationship to like political power and politics, I'm sure you already know what I'm going to say here. It varies from place to place and from time to time. So again, if we look at West Africa during the French colonial period, like the 19th, early 20th century, the Qadiris were seen generally by the French as sort of peaceful and cooperative. They didn't want to cause any fuzz and in order to make things worse in the country and cause more violence. And so they kept peaceful for the most part. Not necessarily collaborating with the French, right? I'm sure some did, but generally not collaborating, but still not causing much trouble. Whereas the Tijaniyya, which was another famous order, they were very prone to fighting back against the French, even violently through jihad of different sorts, but including violent military jihad. So that's one example. Whereas I mentioned Emir Abdul Qadir in Algeria, the freedom fighter, also in the 19th century. He was a Qadiri, and he fought a decades-long battle against French colonialism. He was a military leader, but also a deeply devout Sufi mystic. And so that's sort of the opposite example, right? So this is the theme, the recurring theme in the Qadiri order. Like, it's hard to pin down any characteristics other than their lineage with the founder, so to say, of the order, Jilani. And today, this is the situation that we find ourselves in. Wherever you go in the world where there are Sufis, there is bound to be a few Qadiris. They are still prominent in West African countries like Senegal. They dominate in East Africa. There are plenty of Qadiris in Turkey. They aren't as popular in India as they once were during Mughal times, for example, but they still have a presence there and in places like Pakistan. And they are also still a prominent order all the way over in China. It's also an order with a strong presence in Europe, both with historical ties in Eastern European countries like Bosnia and the Balkans generally, as well as in Russia, because here the Qadiri order is one of the most, if not the most, prominent Sufi order. And of course, with migration from the Islamic world into Western Europe and America, we find many proponents of the order there as well, and many local converts that have chosen to join the tariqah of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. In Sweden, where I live, it is indeed one of the most popular Sufi orders, and especially among people from diaspora communities from Turkey and East Africa. And obviously, it remains prominent in its place of origin as well, in Iraq and Baghdad specifically, where the tomb of al-Jilani is still a common place of pilgrimage and veneration, where Qadiris and others will gather to do dhikr and perform other spiritual practices of remembrance. As you can see then, talking about the Qadiriyya in general terms can be difficult since it is such a diverse tradition without any centralized structure. For this reason, a large part of this episode was dedicated to the figure who stands at the very center of that order's identity, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, and attempted to give a brief and sober overview of his life, teachings, and legacy. And we can see very clearly that not only is he as a person one of the most prominent and famous figures and scholars, saints in Islamic history, but that the order that was named after him and based on him, to a degree, is also possibly the most widespread and popular Sufi order in the world. So to properly know Islam and Islamic history, we have to have some level of knowledge about Abdul Qadir al-Jilani and the Qadiri order. Thank you so much for listening to this, another introduction to some of the great Sufi orders of the world. This has been one of the most requested videos on this channel for its whole history, especially a video on Abdul Qadir. And so I hope this at least satisfied some of those expectations. I look forward to making videos dedicated to other orders in the future as well, particularly perhaps the Chishti order and some of those other most prominent ones. But for now, thank you again for watching. I want to thank my patrons over on patreon.com who support this channel monetarily and without whom none of this would be possible. So as always, a huge thank you to all of you out there who support in that way. You can also support in this way by becoming a patron, and I will leave links to that in the description. Or you can do just give a one-time donation through PayPal or through Patreon as well. It helps me in my mission of bringing you free educational content on the world's religions, on things like Sufism, but also religion, philosophy, and mysticism generally. So I hope more people out there feel inclined to support me here. And that support does not have to be monetary. It can also be simply by subscribing to the channel, following me on my other socials, liking the video, and commenting. You can find those other socials here on screen. I'm on Instagram and I'm on TikTok and other places as well. And there is some exclusive content on there sometimes, more short form videos if you're interested in that, so check that out. I also have another channel called Philippe Home, which is dedicated to my music. Including a new song that I just put out about a month ago, I think, called Tasting with my project Zini, that a lot of you out there have really enjoyed. So thank you for all of your kind words. And I would love if more people wanted to check out that song. So go check that out. Also in my link tree, there's a link tree where you can find all the relevant links to my stuff. So go there and share it if you like it and so on. But again, thank you so much for listening and for watching. I look forward to seeing you in a future video and live streams and so on. I'll see you next time.